New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hi, I'm Leanne Whitney, guest host working alongside longtime host and producer Jeffrey Mishlove and my other colleagues here at New Thinking Aloud. Today, it's a joy to welcome Swami Medhananda to the show. Swami Medhananda is a monk, philosopher, and senior research fellow at the Vedanta Society of Southern California. He earned his PhD from UC Berkeley and has been invited to lecture at institutions such as Harvard, Princeton, and Oxford. From 2010 to 2021, he led the philosophy program at the Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda Educational and Research Institute in India. Swami Medhananda serves as Hindu Chaplain at both UCLA and USC and is the section editor for the International Journal of Hindu Studies. Swami Medhananda has authored 4 books, including Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality and Swami Vivekananda's Vedāntic Cosmopolitanism, as well as editing several academic volumes. Today, Swami Medhananda and I explore Vedanta and several of India's non-dual traditions. We drill down on the core distinction between classical Advaita Vedanta and Sri Ramakrishna's reinterpretation known as Vijnana Vedanta, a vision in which the world is affirmed as real, not separate from Brahman, but its living manifestation. Along the way, we touch on the Bhagavad Gita, the Gita Upanishad, and various schools of yoga, all with an emphasis on practical application for those navigating the spiritual path today. Swami Medhananda is joining me from the Vedanta Society of Southern California, and I now will switch over to the internet interview. Swami Medhananda, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Leanne.
For our audience members who perhaps have not heard any of your talks or read your books, could you give us a overview of your background and what led you to Vedanta?
Sure. So I was born and raised in Boston as an Indian American, raised in a Bengali family. So kind of straddling the border of 2 cultures. And I spoke Bengali at home with my parents. I went through the motions of kind of being what I would call a cultural Hindu. So they would take me to these ritualistic pujas a few times a year, but nothing really gripped me. It was not really inspiring to me. And I became an agnostic by about high school. And then in college, I started exploring the different world's religious spiritual traditions like Buddhism, Christianity, and I read the Bhagavad Gita. So that was the first Hindu scripture that really caught my attention and really inspired me. And after that, I became more interested in kind of studying the spiritual dimensions of Hinduism. And I joined grad school at Berkeley as a master's and PhD student. And within about 1 semester, I decided I would finish my PhD in German philosophy and then move to India and become a monk. I just had this conviction in my mind that that's what I wanted to do. And that conviction kind of intensified and became clear to me when I discovered the life and teachings of Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, his chief disciple. And I just kind of devoured the 9-volume complete works of Swami Vivekananda. I was also reading the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the life and teachings of Ramakrishna. And my ideas about spiritual life, about monastic life kind of got clearer. And right after my PhD, within a couple months, I just bought a one-way ticket to India and I left everything and went to India. And I joined the monastic order, the Ramakrishna order, in Belur Math, which is where the global headquarters are the order runs on a university, which used to be called Vivekananda University, and now has a much longer name. But anyway, so that's where I joined, and I was the head of the philosophy program there. And I was supervising PhD students, and I shifted my academic interests away from German philosophy, strictly speaking, to philosophy of religion and Vedanta especially. And I saw my academic research and my academic work as a kind of spiritual practice where I'm trying to kind of get a deeper understanding of my own spiritual tradition and try to do everything as an offering to the divine. And so in the course of my research, I published a few books. The one that was published in 2018 is called Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, where I defend a new interpretation of Ramakrishna's philosophy as what I call Vijnana Vedanta, which is a life-affirming and ethically oriented non-dual philosophy that is broader than Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, and we can talk about that later, and also has a kind of ethical dimension of compassion where, because you see this world as a living and real and blissful manifestation of the divine, you then spontaneously kind of serve the world by trying to see the divine in all beings.
Thank you first. And that's what I definitely want to get into the heart of the matter, so to speak, with your research. So, and again, just for our viewers who may not be familiar with Vedanta, could you give us a definition of the term and what Vedanta as a one of the orthodox Hindu philosophies, just an overview of it, and then also, an overview of Shankara, and then we'll move into Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda.
Sure. So the term Vedanta is a compound word which consists of two different words. One is Veda and the other is Anta. And Veda refers to the Vedic scriptures, the foundational scriptures of Hinduism, so the Rig Veda and the other Vedas. And Anta means literally end, but probably in this context, it's best to take it to mean something like the culmination. So it literally means a culmination of the Vedas. And what that refers to are the Upanishads. The Upanishads are the Vedic scriptures that constitute kind of the culmination or cream of the Vedas themselves, the highest spiritual teachings contained in the Vedic scriptures. Now, a little bit more broadly, within a few centuries after the Upanishads, two other scriptures came to be considered as part of the kind of Vedāntic, the foundational Vedāntic scriptures apart from the Upanishads. So the Bhagavad Gita is one of them, the scripture I mentioned earlier that really inspired me when I was young. And the third is the Brahma Sutras, which is a very laconic and cryptic text, but it's meant to systematize the teachings of the Upanishads. So these three scriptures taken together, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutras, comprise Vedanta, the foundational scriptures of Vedanta. Now, what's happened, unfortunately, is that in the past few centuries, not just in India, but throughout the world, the term Vedanta has become almost equated with one particular school of Vedanta, namely Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And so many people, when they talk about Vedanta, what they actually have in mind is Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. But that's not accurate, and it's very misleading, because Vedanta is a very broad spiritual tradition. Any Vedantic tradition that provides an interpretation of these three foundational scriptures, or at least the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutra, can be considered a Vedantic school, a Vedantic tradition. And Shankara's is one among many. After Shankara, and even before Shankara, there were other Vedantic schools that provided different commentaries on the same scriptures, on the Upanishads, Gita, and Brahma Sutra. And after Shankara's time especially, a number of bhakti schools of Vedanta emerged. Bhakti means devotion toward a personal God. So these are theistic traditions of Vedanta that are quite different from Shankara's school. And so I think it's really important to understand Vedanta very broadly, as including Shankara's school, but it's not limited to Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta. Now, you asked me to talk about Shankara's school. What is Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta? So I can handle that next. So Shankaracharya was one of the greatest Indian philosophers and saints, and he lived, most scholars think that he lived in about the 8th century CE. And he wrote great commentaries on the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutra. And he would interpret these scriptures from the standpoint of his particular philosophical framework, which is captured neatly in a Sanskrit formula, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahmaevana Paraha, which means Brahman, which is defined as non-dual, attributeless, transpersonal or impersonal, pure consciousness, alone is true or real. That alone exists. And then Jagat Mithya, which means this entire world of names and forms, the fact that I'm speaking to you now, that you're a distinct individual and I'm a distinct individual, all of that is actually unreal from the ultimate standpoint. None of that exists from the ultimate standpoint. And so crucial to Shankara's philosophy is what can be called a two-tier ontology, which means that he distinguishes two standpoints. There's a standpoint of ignorance. Ignorance of what? Ignorance of Brahman. So long as we have not realized that in our deepest essence, we are non-dual pure consciousness, we're going to think of ourselves as distinct individuals living in this world, having a physical body and a mind, seeing trees and tables and chairs and dogs and so on. But the moment we attain direct experiential or spiritual knowledge of our true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, then we ascend to the ultimate standpoint. And from the ultimate standpoint, the only truth is that non-dual pure consciousness. And so many, but not all of Advaita. Actually, there's, so far I've been giving a kind of monolithic account of Shankara's school, but after Shankara's time, different sub-schools of Advaita emerged. And so there's some sub-schools of Advaita Vedanta that emphasize samadhi, which is this kind of special trance state. Nirvikalpa samadhi is considered to be the highest spiritual experience according to this sub-school of Advaita Vedanta. And Ramakrishna had that experience, and he explained it with a simple metaphor. He said, imagine a salt doll, a doll made of salt that goes to measure the depth of the ocean. But the moment it sets foot in the ocean, it melts into the ocean. So there's no longer any salt doll. So the idea here is that in this highest non-dual state of Nirvikalpa samadhi, your individuality is merged in non-dual pure consciousness. There's no longer any subject-object duality at all, and you lose all external consciousness. So there's no perception of a world. There's not even a recognition of yourself as an individual. There's just non-dual pure consciousness. And so that captures the last phrase in that Sanskrit expression that I said earlier. So Brahma Satyam, I explained, non-dual pure consciousness alone is real. Jagat Mithya, this entire world of names and forms, turns out to be unreal from the ultimate standpoint. Us as individuals, unreal. And I forgot to add, the personal God, also unreal from the ultimate standpoint. What do I mean by the personal God? Well, the theistic God. And by theistic, I mean the omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God who is a supreme being, who responds to our prayers, who creates, preserves, and destroys this world, and so on, who governs this world.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of yoga. I'm a long studier of Patanjali's yoga psychology. So Ishvara, in that system of thought, the personal God would be Ishvara. Is that?
Well, it's a great question. And the thing is, I'm teaching a class now on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And the textbook I'm using, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a wonderful book. Edwin Bryant's The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. You should look at it. So he's defending strongly a theistic interpretation of Ishvara in Patanjali's scripture, the Yoga Sutras. But he acknowledges that that's a controversial interpretation. In fact, if you go deep into the scholarship, you're going to find a whole spectrum of interpretations of the concept of Ishvara in the Yoga Sutra. So I'll just give you an example of somebody at the other side of the spectrum, Gerald James Larson, who's a very important scholar of Sankhya and yoga philosophy. He defends a kind of almost atheistic interpretation of Ishvara in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and kind of says this is nothing like the theistic God. And in fact, one of the virtues of Patanjali's philosophical system is that it doesn't ask us to have faith in a theistic God of that sort. But Edwin Bryant himself is a Vaishnava scholar, and is a devout bhakta. He leans toward devotionalism. And so that partly informs his reading the Yoga Sutras. And so I'm partial to it too, because I'm also devotional by nature. Now, whether that's an accurate interpretation of the Yoga Sutras itself is kind of an open question. So I would say, so as not to muddy the waters, I would say that in Vedanta, the theistic God is omnipotent and the creator of this world and omniscient and so on. And it's a little bit unclear exactly how we should define Ishvara in the Yoga Sutras. But you should definitely feel free to interpret in a theistic way, but just be aware that there are other interpretations that kind of downplay the theistic dimension of Ishvara.
Yes. And so you're mostly speaking of Shankara's Advaita here, and this idea that pure consciousness is the only real existent.
Yes.
Ultimately. And this is Maya, illusion, the world of names and forms.
Yes. And the personal God. Yeah.
And the personal God, right. And then, yes, if you feel like there's anything else to add there, please do. Otherwise, maybe we could start to speak to the distinction between Shankara and Sri Ramakrishna. And maybe it's appropriate here. So it's Jnana Yoga is basically what Shankara is speaking to.
That's perfect.
And I want to get into the yogas
Absolutely.
later.
That's a perfect segue. Yes. I was literally about to say the one thing I missed, which I was about to explain, is Jnana Yoga. So it has to do with the scheme of spiritual practices taught by Shankara. Okay. This is what Shankara says, on my understanding. So in Vedanta in general, there are a number of basic yogas, and each of these yogas is a fundamental spiritual practice. Okay. So one of them is called karma yoga. It's the yoga of selfless action. Okay. So you engage in your duties in the world, but you do them as an offering to the divine, and that's a way of kind of making spiritual progress. There's bhakti yoga, which is the yoga of devotion toward a personal God. So any kind of devotional practices like worship, prayer, japa, mantra japa, mental repetition of a name of God, and so on, all fall under devotionalism, bhakti yoga. Raja yoga or dhyana yoga is the yoga of meditation and concentration. That's what's taught in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, for instance, which we just talked about. And then fourth, and finally, and most importantly for Shankara, is jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. Okay. Now, what does Shankara say? He says the following. And if you want a reference, this is especially developed in his commentary on the very first sutra of the Brahma Sutras. So Atato Brahma Jigyasa 1.1.1 of the Brahma Sutra, he explains this. He says, look, there are two levels of spiritual aspirant. There are inferior spiritual aspirants and there are superior spiritual aspirants. Okay. Inferior spiritual aspirants, manda adhikaris, are those who have impure minds. That's what makes them inferior. They have impure minds, which are restless and distracted and running toward various worldly things. For those inferior spiritual aspirants, the best practices are karma yoga and bhakti yoga. And in fact, they're not even in airtight compartments. As I just said, karma yoga has a kind of devotional element built into it, at least as taught in the Bhagavad Gita, for instance, because the work I do it as an offering to the divine. And then that becomes bhakti yoga and karma yoga kind of folded into one. Shankara says, anybody who has an impure mind, who is still identified with the physical body, must, of necessity, practice karma yoga and bhakti yoga in order to purify their mind. Ideally, what results from the sincere practice of karma yoga and bhakti yoga? You get promoted to the next grade, the higher up grade of spiritual aspirant. You become a superior spiritual aspirant. What makes a superior spiritual aspirant superior? They have a very pure mind. What does it mean to have a pure mind? It means that it's a mind that is focused only on spiritual things. You have total detachment toward anything in the world. You no longer have any worldly attachments or desires. So that's a very high bar. He sets a very high bar for making the cut to be a superior spiritual aspirant. And your identification with the physical body is attenuated, if not completely eliminated at this point. Now, once you become a superior spiritual aspirant, then Shankara says, you need to stop practicing karma yoga and bhakti yoga and just practice jnana yoga, the higher path of knowledge. Okay. What is the path of knowledge? It's basically a simple thing to explain and almost impossible to practice for most people. It consists of 3 steps: Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana. These are terms taken from the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. Shravana means hearing, literally. What do you hear? This superior spiritual aspirant goes to an Advaita guru, somebody in Shankara's tradition, who then teaches the spiritual aspirant a Mahavakya. There are 4 great sayings. One of them, for instance, is Tat Tvam Asi. You are non-dual, pure consciousness. And if my mind is sufficiently pure, if I really am a superior spiritual aspirant, just by hearing that teaching, I can have the highest realization of my true nature as non-dual, pure consciousness. If it doesn't happen immediately, I need to do 2 more. I need to do 2 other steps. The second step is manana. So after just hearing it, manana means intellectual reflection on that great saying, on my identity with non-dual pure consciousness. What does it mean? It means, well, I need to understand at least intellectually what it means. And secondly, I had to remove any lingering doubts in my mind about maybe other ways of thinking about my identity. How do I know I'm not the physical body? There are other schools of Hindu thought like Charvaka materialism, which believe that we're the physical body and that consciousness ceases after death. Well, how do we refute that position or that view from the standpoint of Shankara's school? That all happens in the Manana period. There's also Buddhism. There's also Jainism. There are also other schools of Vedanta which don't accept this view or have a different interpretation of Aham Brahmasmi or Tattvamasi. So how do we refute those competing schools, those conflicting philosophical traditions? Okay, all that happens in the Manana stage. Finally, though, we have to reach the stage of Nididhyasana. That's the 3rd step in the threefold practice of Jnana Yoga. This is the stage in which we try to internalize this great saying, this great truth that we are non-dual pure consciousness. And what does internalization mean? Well, it means to meditate on it deeply and also to kind of live it. And that's the hardest thing in a way. It's very easy to talk about Advaita and to say that I'm Brahman. And the hardest thing in the world to actually practice it and to live it. Because it actually means you're no longer identified with the physical body or even with the mind, which is also considered insentient according to Indian philosophical schools, or at least Hindu philosophical schools. So through the combined practice of Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana, finally, the practice of Jnana Yoga should result in the direct experiential realization of our true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. And when we have that realization, if we come back from this state of samadhi, we look upon this entire world as a dream. Okay, just imagine, I like to use this analogy. Imagine that I'm in a dream, and there are 3 possibilities here. One is I'm in the dream, and I don't know that I'm dreaming. So that's the way that I normally dream, for instance. I'm not a lucid dreamer, and most people are not lucid dreamers, right? That's ignorance. That corresponds to the standpoint of ignorance. The second standpoint is lucid dreaming. I'm in the dream, but I know I'm dreaming. And I can have more fun in the dream and even like maybe manipulate the dream and not be so attached to the thing. So if things are going badly, I can know in my heart of hearts that it's not even real. So I don't need to worry about it. So this lucid dreamer corresponds to what Advaita Vedanta calls the Jivan Mukta, which means the person who is liberated while still in the physical body. This is the person who, after having attained the highest non-dual realization in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, comes back to this world, but is now a lucid dreamer. He knows that this world is unreal, he or she. And so he treats it accordingly. Nothing really affects him. But there's an even higher standpoint, which is called Videha Mukti, which means liberation, the final liberation or the ultimate liberation after the death of the physical body. So there's I don't know how deeply you want me to go into the technicalities of things, but there's a big debate within Advaita Vedanta about whether it's even possible to have full Advaitic realization and still inhabit a physical body. Okay, which means is the state of Jivan Mukti even possible? Is it possible to be fully liberated while still in a physical body? And what most classical Advaitins say in response to this question is no. They accept Jivan Mukti, but what they say is even the Jivan Mukta, the one who is liberated while still in the physical body, has what they call in Sanskrit avidya lesha, which means they have a trace of ignorance, which accounts for their continued physical existence and their continued perception of this dream world. But that when you have the full liberation, once you've completely eradicated even those remaining traces of ignorance, Then you leave the physical body, which was never real in the first place, which corresponds to the third state in my dream analogy. So the first state is I'm in the dream, I don't know I'm dreaming. Second state is I'm in the dream and I'm lucidly dreaming, so I know I'm in the dream. That corresponds to the Jivan Mukta. The third state would be I wake up from the dream. The dream breaks. I'm no longer in the dream. That corresponds to Videha Mukti, which according to most classical Advaitins corresponds to the full or total liberation. You only get this after you leave the physical body. Good riddance to the physical body, because so long as it's there, there has to be some slight trace of ignorance, which accounts for my continued existence and my continued perception of this entire world. Okay, so that's all with respect to Shankara. Is that okay? Or
right.
Would you like?
Well, I think now I'm wondering, and I don't want to jump ahead, but I guess I am, that you are going to now bridge to the Vijnana.
Yes.
So that liberation then becomes an embodied spirituality.
Yes.
Where it's the dance of the Great Mother. And this is sort of a playful realm of names and forms.
Yes.
But that, yeah. So, yeah, please share.
Absolutely.
Did Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda believe that we can remain embodied while liberated? And just to take the heat off the terms of liberation and enlightenment, I think it can be more practical to think in terms of suffering, non-suffering. Because really, non-suffering
that is liberation.
Is ultimately a liberation. And I think that it has more practical application for people to steer themselves towards well-being than lofty ideals of liberation.
Which may be too abstract or something. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah, that's great. So Ramakrishna, he distinguishes two fundamental stages in spiritual experience, which he calls Jnana and Vijnana. So Jnana just means knowledge, but it means the highest non-dual knowledge, what we've just been talking about in the context of Shankara's school. And for Shankara's school, that's the be-all and end-all. There's nothing beyond that. What Ramakrishna says is startling and radical. What he says is, imagine this. You're trying to reach the roof of a house, and there's a staircase leading up to the roof. So what do you do to get to the roof of the house? You climb up the staircase. And he likens that to the process of Jnana Yoga. This Advaitic, he says, neti neti vichara, which means not this, not this. Brahman is not this world. Brahman are not these names and forms. Brahman is not my body. Brahman is not my mind. Until the person reaches the roof. You renounce everything that is not Brahman. You reach the roof. That reaching the roof corresponds to the state of nirvikalpa samadhi, which is considered to be the highest Advaitic spiritual experience. That is like the salto merging into the non-dual ocean. And so you realize your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. There's no longer any subject-object duality. That's completely transcended. You lose all external consciousness. And then Ramakrishna says the following. He says, most people, ordinary souls, the term he uses in Bengali is jivakoti. They leave their body within 21 days of remaining in the state of nirvikalpa samadhi because they don't even eat, because they have no external consciousness. They don't eat anything. The body drops off. And who cares? Because the body's unreal anyway. Okay, but then he says, and this is what's so unique about Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. He says, there are some special, highly spiritual souls, divinely commissioned souls that he calls Ishvara Kotis. They're not Jiva Kotis. They're not ordinary souls. They're Jiva Kotis. These Ishvara Kotis can reach the roof. And then what happens is they go on to attain this further state of what he calls Vijnana. So they move from the state of Jnana to Vijnana. And the prefix V before the word Jnana acts as a kind of grammatical intensifier, which just means deeper, more comprehensive, more expansive. Okay.
Right. So, yes. I'm sorry. So Jnana is like knowledge. I mean, Veda, I believe, means knowledge. But yeah, Vijnana is more like a embodied or deeper lived.
More intimate. Everything. It has all those connotations of a kind of deeper, more expansive, more intimate knowledge of the divine reality. Okay? Mm-hmm. Because in Jnana, what you have is the direct spiritual and liberative knowledge of your true nature as impersonal, attributeless, non-dual pure consciousness. But what Ramakrishna says is the Vijnani has a more expansive realization of the same divine reality as having not only that non-dual pure consciousness dimension, the nirguna or impersonal dimension, but equally a saguna dimension, a personal dimension, the divine mother that you were talking about, which he would call Shakti or Kali. So the Vijnani realizes that the divine reality is equally personal and impersonal. And then it completely transforms the way that the Vijnani looks upon this world. So using that same metaphor of the staircase, what Ramakrishna says is the Jnani sees everything as a dream, as an illusion. The Vijnani, by contrast, after reaching the roof, will look back at the staircase and say, wait a minute, but the staircase is made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. So the Vijnani, instead of looking upon this world as a dream, will come back from this state of nirvikalpa samadhi and look upon everything as a blissful, playful manifestation of Divine Mother itself. All the names and forms of this world are actually different manifestations of Divine Mother. And the terms that Ramakrishna would use are nitya and lila. Nitya means the eternal, and lila means the sportive play of Divine Mother. And he says, the Jnani is the one who just wants to stick to the nitya, the eternal non-dual Brahman, and leave his body there. The Vijnani, just playfully, in a spirit of sportive play, as a kind of playmate of Divine Mother, can ascend to the nitya, this plane of the eternal, but then descend to the plane of the lila. This whole world is a cosmic play of Divine Mother, and participate in the divine play. And then whenever the Vijnani feels like, can also go up to the nitya again. So it kind of, the Ishvara Koti, the Vijnani, is able to go back and forth between the nitya and the lila, ascend and descend the staircase from the nitya to the lila and back.
Yeah. Or in nir, the prefix nir, I believe, is without. So nirguna, without attributes. Guna meaning attributes. Nirvikalpa, without contents.
Or like conceptual or mental content, something like that. Yeah. Without any kind of thoughts.
Yeah. And so then, yes, coming back and aligning, if that might be the right word, or I love your term intimacy. With intimacy, being with the attributes or with any of the conceptualizations or contents, and guiding, playing, being with. So it's a both and right?
Absolutely.
Both and the form and the formlessness. Yeah.
And the impersonal and the personal. Exactly. So I think that's the best way to put it, is that Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta upholds a both and kind of thinking, a both and paradigm, as opposed to an either or kind of thinking, where, well, if the ultimate reality is impersonal, then it cannot be personal, which is how Shankara school reasons. And then there's some bhakti schools like Ramanuja school and Madhva school. These are both devotional traditions within Vedanta. They hold the opposite view. The ultimate reality is only our beloved personal God, Vishnu. So therefore, it cannot be non-dual pure consciousness. And there are some devotional traditions which accept the reality of both the personal and the impersonal, but there's still a kind of hierarchy there. So the schools I'm thinking of are Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which is Chaitanya school, which is a devotionalism practice toward Sri Krishna, the supreme being Krishna. And Nirguna Brahman in that school is considered to be a kind of minor aspect or peripheral brilliance of Krishna himself. So that the realization of non-dual Brahman is a much lower and less blissful realization than the realization of the supreme person Krishna. And there's another school called Vallabha Shuddha Advaita, which holds a similar view, not identical, but a similar view. And then Ramakrishna comes along and teaches Vijnana Vedanta, which fully embraces not only the reality of both Brahman and Shakti, so the nirguna, impersonal, non-dual pure consciousness aspect of the divine, but equally embraces the reality and accepts the reality of Shakti. But unlike even those devotional schools of Gaudiya Vaishnavism and Shuddha Advaita, there's no hierarchy. And he places the non-dual pure consciousness and Shakti on an equal footing. And he says, really, how you want to realize the divine is a matter of temperament. It's a matter of preference rather than one of value. And the question is whether you want to eat sugar or become sugar. And becoming sugar is this classical Advaitic non-dual ideal of Shankara school, which is you merge your individuality in non-dual pure consciousness. And eating sugar is the devotional ideal, which is you can even find this ideal in Christianity and the other Abrahamic religions, where the ideal, where salvation consists in dwelling in an eternal heaven, retaining an individuality, but this is a perfected, liberated individuality. In a heaven, in an eternal heaven, with your beloved personal God, and you're lovingly worshiping and serving personal God in the form that you love most. So these are the two ideals. He puts them on an equal footing and then says, take your pick, whether you want to eat sugar, become sugar. It's not a matter of higher or lower, one is better than the other, but it's a matter of preference.
Right. So it opens up the possibilities. And I mean, what's become clear, hopefully to definitely viewers who are newer to these systems of thoughts, is how many systems of thoughts there are in the Hindu tradition. Like there's just schools and streams of schools and so long-term arguments, if you will, making cases for going back thousands of years. You said Shankara 800. Patanjali for the yoga school, they think 200, or in the CE, the current era, Buddha sometimes 500 BCE. But what I am appreciative of what I have been exposed to in your body of work so far, and I love how you bring Aurobindo in as well, because I do think logical consistency has to be argued for. So if everything is pure consciousness, then the full extent of the arguments, and I certainly have not read all the texts of all the schools of Indian philosophy, but the appearance of, let's say, good and evil, or suffering, and the paths out of suffering, I do believe that a logical consistency exists inside your wisdom traditions to make the case for pure consciousness is the real, the ultimate reality. And it's manifested here in forms. And that's why we can learn to navigate away from suffering and towards well-being, because the intelligence is intimately seeped inside our cells, or inside all the energy and information that's actually flowing in this realm. So I don't know if that converges with the practical applications of Vivekananda's body of work and all these different yogas. Like, they're practical because they lead towards the understanding or the knowledge of pure consciousness, and also lead us away from suffering, so we can take asana, a comfortable seat in the body, while we're playing in the names and forms.
Yeah, I think that's nicely put, but I want to maybe nuance it slightly from the standpoint of all three of these major figures, Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo. I don't think they posit the realization of non-dual pure consciousness as a mandatory ideal for everybody. And I think that's one of the virtues of their philosophy, as opposed to Shankara's school. Because I think at the end of the day, there's a kind of sectarianism or narrowness in the position that everybody needs ultimately to realize non-dual pure consciousness. Because what does that mean? It means that a Christian, a devout Christian, a very sincere Christian who follows the teachings of Jesus and whatever, just going to heaven is not enough. They have to go beyond that to some kind of non-dual ideal that their scriptures don't even teach, or arguably that they don't care about, or they don't believe in. Same goes for devout Muslims, same goes for devout Jews, same goes for any devotional Hindus. And I don't think that was Ramakrishna's view. What Ramakrishna said is that there are two equally valuable salvific ideals, both of which are states of total liberation from all suffering. I think that's a nice way to put it. Liberation from suffering, except that liberation from suffering takes two fundamentally different forms: the eating sugar form and the becoming sugar form. And not everybody needs to become sugar. And he even says, devotees of the personal God, they don't want to become sugar. Because if they become sugar, they can't taste sugar, and they want to taste sugar. That means they have to maintain some separation from God in order to lovingly commune with the personal God. And so I think that their understanding of the state of liberation, total liberation from suffering, is more expansive, more capacious than any of the traditional schools of Vedanta, because they equally embrace these two the devotional ideal of salvation and also of liberation and the non-dual form. And we always have to keep in mind, they're able to do that because the divine itself is equally non-dual pure consciousness and Shakti. And so the realization of Shakti is enough for liberation. You don't have to go beyond Shakti to realize the impersonal, attributeless, non-dual pure consciousness. She is divine consciousness herself. And so just realizing Divine Mother is total liberation from suffering.
Right. And that word pure is interesting to play with. I often like to think of it as it sits inside itself. That's why it's non-dual. There's nothing other than it, no matter whether we call it Shakti or Brahman or whatever word you're pointing to. Again, our words are only pointers.
I know.
Right?
The thing is, there's another problem of translation, right? Because pure consciousness is English. And the question is, what exactly is the term in Sanskrit that pure consciousness is the translation of? And it's not immediately obvious, but so in Vedanta, ultimate reality is conceived by all the schools as Sat Chit Ananda. Sat, existence, Chit typically translated as consciousness, and then Ananda as bliss. And depending on the school of Vedanta we're talking about, they interpret these terms in different ways. Now, pure consciousness is specific to Shankara school, actually. That's not something that all the schools will define in the same way or even accept. It just depends. Like, as I said, Ramanuja and Madhva's, their schools don't even accept pure consciousness in Shankara's sense. And so it depends on how we define the term pure here. That doesn't mean that they love impure consciousness. It's not a contrast between pure and... But what does purity mean in the context of the non-dual school of Vedanta of Shankara? Well, it means non-intentional consciousness. I'm using intentional in a technical philosophical sense. Right now, the consciousness I have is intentional in the technical philosophical sense because there's an object of consciousness. There's subject-object duality. I'm conscious of my laptop and the fact that I'm speaking to you now and that my laptop is distinct from me. So all of that is what's called intentional consciousness or intentional awareness. Pure consciousness is pure of any kind of subject-object duality, pure of any kind of object to consciousness, so that there's just non-dual I-ness or isness without even any kind of subject-object duality. So if we define pure consciousness in that way, which is the way that Shankara defines pure consciousness, then bhaktas will say, I don't want that. I don't care for that. And what Ramakrishna will add is, even if the bhakta doesn't want it, God can still give it to the bhakta. And the bhakta, the devotee, doesn't even need to practice the path of knowledge in order to get there. God can just grant his devotee this experience of non-dual pure consciousness. Even if the devotee doesn't want it, maybe the devotee will ask God, hey, I love you, Krishna, but I want a taste of non-dual pure consciousness, and then I want to come back to you. And he might give it, right? So I just wanted to add that nuance. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. And to clarify, the roof coming back down the stairs, can we in the both and? So
Yes.
One can hold that all is pure consciousness at the same time as watching all the names and forms or being present to or engaging with. Right.
Yeah, that's the whole point of Vijnana. The Vijnana. So here's the way I would put the difference between Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta and Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. The technical way to frame the question is, what exactly is the ontological status of names and forms? Okay. The laptop, the table, the trees, individual people. According to Shankara's school, this entire world of names and forms is nothing but Brahman. Okay? And so when we use that formulation, you might say, well, that sounds a lot like Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. How is that different? Everything is pure consciousness. Shankara will say, but there's a catch. The catch is everything, every name and form is pure consciousness when you subtract the names and forms from everything. Subtract the laptopness of this laptop and what's left is non-dual pure consciousness. Subtract the Swami Medhananda Medhananda-ness from Swami Medhananda and what's left is the same non-dual pure consciousness. Subtract the AirPods-ness of the AirPods and what's left is the same non-dual pure consciousness. And by contrast, Ramakrishna had this ecstatic realization of Vijnana, and he described it one day. He said, I was doing puja. He was doing ritualistic worship of Divine Mother Kali, sitting in Dakshineshwar. And suddenly he said, I saw the metal vessels I was using in my ritualistic worship as divine mother, divine consciousness. A cat walked into the room. I saw the cat as divine consciousness. The door sill suddenly became divine consciousness to me. So the difference here is Ramakrishna says you don't need to subtract anything. In fact, there's an interesting thing in his life story that when he was very young, before he dropped out of school at around the age of 6. But before he dropped out, he was in a math class, and he was quite good at addition, but he could never subtract. He was bad at subtracting. So I'm thinking of giving a talk called "Why Sri Ramakrishna could not subtract." But that's the idea: is that you don't need to in this Vijnana realization, you don't have to subtract anything. It's not Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. You don't say non-dual pure consciousness alone is real. So that means that this personal God is unreal, that this world of names and forms is unreal, individual souls are unreal. No, you don't have to subtract anything. The names and forms themselves are real manifestations of divine consciousness. And arguably, Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta gives us a better framework for interpreting and getting at the heart of the original Vedantic scriptures. The Chandogya Upanishad raises the question, how exactly does the ultimate reality Brahman relate to this world of names and forms? And it uses several metaphors which have become famous. I'm sure you're familiar with them. One is formless clay being shaped into different kinds of clay pots. And another is molten gold being shaped into different gold ornaments, like golden earrings and golden bracelets and golden necklace. Both of those metaphors lend themselves much more easily to the Vijnana Vedanta paradigm. The idea is that every name and form is a real manifestation of Brahman, of divine consciousness. Not that you have to subtract. So, we can say, using these metaphors, yeah, the golden earrings are nothing but gold. Does that mean that the earrings themselves are an illusory form? No. So what's the more plausible way to explain the relationship between a golden earring and the molten gold? Is it to say the golden earring is an illusory appearance of the gold? No, that's weird. The golden earring is a real formation of or manifestation of gold. It's nothing but gold, and yet the form is real. That's Vijnana Vedanta.
Beautiful. So let's move into the practical applications then. And I'm thinking, oh boy, the chapter 17 of the Gita, where, please correct me what chapter it is, where Krishna is teaching Arjuna. And for anybody who is not familiar with this text, right? Bhagavad Gita, Song of the Lord, the first chapter starts with the despondency of Arjuna, his suffering, his states of suffering. He's in a pickle, finding his way from this decision or this embodiment of having to social justice, right? Having to embody this warrior in order to, fight for, if we can use that term, social justice. But I just want to make that clear that that text, it's a core text, as you mentioned, of Vedanta, and it is a teaching text that shows through the yogas that moving from suffering to liberation is possible. But the main character starts in a suffering state. He's despondent.
I just want to add one thing. I think that's a great way to explain the text at this great scripture. And I think it's also telling that traditionally, when you recite the Gita, at the end of each chapter, you give the chapter a title. And the title of the first chapter of the Gita is Arjuna Vishada Yoga, the yoga of Arjuna's depression, the yoga of Arjuna's despair and suffering. And I think that's very profound and very relevant to contemporary times. The idea is what Swami Vivekananda said very powerfully: suffering is the great eye-opener. Suffering itself can be a very powerful yoga. It can be one of the most potent ways to reconnect us with the divine in our deeper self. So please continue. Yeah.
Couldn't agree more. I love that text. So whatever this chapter number is, which you will reveal in a minute, where Krishna teaches Arjuna about lust, greed, anger, I believe he lists as
16.
the evils. It's 16. Okay. Yeah. Like the evils, though this is gonna cause you to see my lower forms.
Demonic qualities, asuri sampati,
because those are very prevalent on our planet.
Absolutely.
I mean, they're very prevalent in this realm. So if you could share with us some practical applications or some teachings from the Gita or Vivekananda, but because I like to make these talks practical for people who might be in states of suffering or, they flip their lid often and they don't know how to control their anger or their rage or overly lusty.
Sure.
But there's very practical material involved in the
Absolutely.
yogas of your tradition.
So look, absolutely. And I think it's always important to bring things back to spiritual practice in the day-to-day. And so I think one way to begin to talk about that is the following, which is, look, coming back to this overarching theme of our conversation, which is the world real or is the world unreal? Think about it this way. Once I realize that I'm in a dream, what's the likelihood that I'm going to make it my life's mission to serve these dream entities? It's not going to make much sense. So Shankara's Advaita Vedanta arguably kind of pulls a rug out from under any attempt to kind of justify social justice, as you were talking about. Because what are you fighting for? They're all unreal things. Even the fighting is unreal. The activism is unreal. It's part of Maya, right? Now, if we shift to Ramakrishna's paradigm of Vijnana Vedanta, everything becomes real. And then everything has a kind of deeper metaphysical justification in divine consciousness. And so one of Ramakrishna's most strongly recommended practices was what he called Shiva Gyane Jiva Seva, which means serve others, serve other beings in a spirit of worship by trying to see the divine, trying to see Divine Mother in all beings. That's a very practical application. I think one of the biggest problems of our age, in a way, is narcissism. Time magazines, they have this Person of the Year thing, right? So 2006, the Person of the Year was you. I mean, literally you. It means all of us. We've all taken center stage thanks to the internet and social media, now with AI and sophisticated algorithms, which are just like creating these echo chambers around us. And we become solipsistic and narcissistic in a way that's extremely dangerous and bad for our mental health, frankly. And one of the best things we can do to improve our mental health, to be happier, more fulfilled, to improve our well-being, is to break out of the confines of this ego, this lower self. And one of the best ways to do that is to serve others in whatever way we can or that's available to us. So that falls under karma yoga, but it's a very powerful practice when you see everything as divine consciousness. So that's one practical implication. And then secondly, remember I mentioned that in the context of Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta, there's a hierarchy of spiritual practices. He puts bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion, and karma yoga, the yoga of selfless action, on a lower footing. They're preparatory disciplines for people with impure minds, for inferior spiritual aspirants, that you stop practicing once you become a superior spiritual aspirant. And then the only practice should be the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga. Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, and this is also supported by Vivekananda and by Sri Aurobindo, encourages, first of all, it rejects this idea of a hierarchy of the yogas. And it says we can and should try to practice all four of the yogas simultaneously and to harmonize them in our day-to-day life. And that's also very powerful and very practical. Sri Aurobindo has this great way to just capture this whole idea. All life is yoga. Literally all of life is yoga. We just talked about how suffering itself can be a very powerful kind of yoga. But literally anything. You're talking about emotional reactivity. So imagine you're married. Well, your spouse says something to you that ticks you off. Your immediate impulse is to react. But if as a spiritual aspirant, can you see this moment as an opportunity for spiritual practice? If you can catch yourself in the moment of emotional reactivity, you can nip it in the bud. And then you can take one of two approaches. One is the approach recommended by followers of Shankara and more recently by Eckhart Tolle, one of the great contemporary spiritual masters. And what he would say is, at that very moment, the moment you recognize that you're reacting emotionally to what somebody has said, your spouse has said, for instance, just take a step back from that emotional reactivity, from whatever that emotion is, whether it's anger or something else. The moment you do that, you become separate from, you become the witness to that emotional reaction. And then you're no longer identified with it. You're no longer its slave. And then if you keep developing that practice, if you keep cultivating that practice, what happens is eventually that reactivity will not even emerge. So, and that's also the basis of Buddhist mindfulness practice, which has become so popular throughout the world, and especially in the West. You just be aware, non-judgmentally aware. So Buddhist mindfulness really means non-judgmental awareness. The moment you judge, you're giving that thought or that emotion or that feeling or that reaction more power than it should be given, right? But the moment you can really recognize it for what it is in a non-judgmental way, then it just arises and then it'll pass away. And there's a beautiful verse in the Gita, one of my favorite verses in chapter 2 of the Gita, which says the same thing. So it's not that Vedanta doesn't have a practice of mindfulness. It also has a very powerful practice of mindfulness in it. And I won't read the Sanskrit, but the basic idea is, imagine that you are this vast, infinite ocean. And imagine that these distracting, unwholesome thoughts or desires are little streams entering into that ocean. Is the ocean affected? No. It's not the least bothered. So you should, whenever a worldly thought or desire or emotion enters in your mind, you should feel that vastness and just say, and recognize it, be non-judgmentally aware of it, but it won't bother you anymore. You won't immediately identify with it.
Yeah, the spaciousness. You're using vastness.
Absolutely.
Yeah, spaciousness is
absolutely.
what comes up for me. And
yes.
And non-judgment for sure, because nothing can transform unless it transforms in awareness. It's just going to go back to the logical consistency of consciousness. And I love also the metaphor used in the Katha Upanishad, or maybe the term yoga, to join, to harness, this idea of like harnessing the horses. Like you stay
wonderful.
aware. Yeah. And you don't want, basically, you want to be master of your own mind. You don't want your mind to run off in directions that you are not aware of the mission that you're sending it on. And perhaps we could even distill to what these practices, I mean, it's certainly Yoga Chitta-vritti Nirodha. Patanjali, his second sutra, he's pointing to that. And perhaps a lot of these Hindu traditions are. It's like, understand your mind, so you can utilize it as Shakti while you're in the body, but you're going to send it on the missions of well-being and not on the missions of suffering.
Absolutely. I think it's wonderful that you brought up this beautiful chariot metaphor in the Katha Upanishad. So I think that really captures it, which is the soul, the eternal soul within us, the Atman, is the rider in the chariot. So imagine him or her as king or queen. Okay. Then how does this metaphor proceed? Well, buddhi, the higher intellect, is the charioteer, the one holding the reins. The reins are the mind, the sense-oriented mind. And the horses that the reins are connected to are the sense organs. And the roads on which the horses are traveling are sense objects, this world of, right? And so ultimately, so first of all, so the mental reins need to be reined in, literally, so that the horses can be reined in. If you can rein them in, you go toward the path of liberation from all suffering. If you can, if you let the horses be unruly, then you're going to end up suffering in life. And so at the end of the day, what Vedanta teaches, and I think this is extremely practical, instead of looking upon ourselves and other people as bodies, as physical bodies, which is really the bane of especially contemporary existence, there's this kind of relentless ideology being drilled into our heads that we are the body. We try to make us as pretty, as beautiful as possible. And then Instagram and all these visually oriented social media apps are kind of strengthening that whole tendency. Vedanta says, ultimately, we are eternal, immaterial, non-physical souls, separate from the body-mind complex. The more you identify with the soul, the deeper eternal soul within, the happier you'll be. And then, coming to your question, we can think of our body and our minds not as something unreal, but as our instruments, as instruments of the divine soul. So, for instance, if you have a car, right? You don't say, I am my car. You say, I use my car to get around. It's my instrument. It's a vehicle that I use to serve my purposes. Likewise, the soul uses the physical body and uses the mind as its instruments to fulfill its spiritual aims. I think that if we could, that requires a complete reorientation of our outlook on life and how we see ourselves. But if we can move in that direction, this entire world, each person will be much happier and more fulfilled as a result.
It's such a beautiful, powerful metaphor. And if the car isn't running well, so if we don't take care of mental health or physical health, then we get in these binds. The car is going to put along. It's not going to actually make it to its destination.
Won't move. Yeah, right.
Right. And the soul is the pure seeing in the vehicle.
Yeah, and I look, again, pure seeing kind of like skews the interpretation of the soul toward Shankara school again, and I would be a little cautious there. See, here's another kind of, I see this as a difference between this Kathopanishad metaphor of the chariot and Shankara's understanding of the Atman. Because for Shankara, the non-dual Atman, the non-dual self, is radically transcendental. It's radically transcendent, which means it has nothing to do with this world, because the world is a dream anyway. There's no real ultimate connection between our non-dual self and the chariot, which is the physical body, the mind, the sense organs, and so on. Again, I think that if we interpret this chariot metaphor in the Upanishads from the standpoint of Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, we end up with a more plausible interpretation. The whole point of the metaphor is that the rider in the chariot, that king or that queen, the Atman, is the one directing the buddhi and saying, hey, don't go there, go here. Hey, don't let the horses run wild. You got to control the horses. The soul is giving directives to the higher intellect, which is then controlling the mind, which is then controlling the sense organs. You can only make sense of that from an ultimate standpoint if you accept Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta paradigm, because then the soul is not this kind of completely, strictly aloof. You use the language of pure seeing. In the Sanskrit term here is sakshi. It means the pure witness, right? But the problem is when you posit a strictly pure witness, then you end up severing any connection with this world. And there's a similar problem, actually, since you love Patanjali, and we're talking about this in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, is a lot of scholars have talked about this. It's a huge problem in Patanjali's philosophy, which is there's a kind of ultimate metaphysical dualism between Purusha on the one hand and Prakriti on the other. And then there's this question of, wait, is there any connection between them? And if not, there's an even weirder question, it gets trippy. In Patanjali's system, who exactly is bound and liberated? Who is the one who feels bound? Who is the one who gets liberation? And Patanjali and Sankhya, which is the philosophy on which Patanjali's school is based, they both say the Purusha is eternally liberated. The Purusha is never bound, so it can never be liberated. It's eternally liberated. So it's not the Purusha that's bound. And Prakriti is defined as insentient. Even the mind is insentient. And so that also can't be a thing that's seeking liberation. And so you end up with this really weird kind of problem of explaining even. So I think Advaita shares some aspects with Sankhya and Yoga, which is that the Sakshi, Atman, is strictly transcendental. There's no real connection between the pure witness, the self, and this world of names and forms, the body and the mind. Whereas in Vijnana Vedanta, the soul, the eternal individual soul, the Jivatma, uses the body and the mind as its instruments. And so the aim of the soul is then to manifest our innate divinity at the level of the body, at the level of the mind. And then all sorts of things in the world start to take on meaning. Like even I gave a talk a while ago called Spiritualizing Physical Fitness. So now there's a rationale for keeping healthy, right? Not just to keep the body in good working order, but as a way to manifest that divinity that's latent within us.
Yeah. Well, I used pure seeing instead of pure witness in the hopes of intimating that it wasn't.
Oh, I see.
That it wasn't actually
Okay.
completely separate. Right. But I do understand the conundrum or why these arguments have lasted so long. Because again, it's words, it's terminology.
Yeah. Well, look. So instead of seeing, I would prefer words like governing or directing. Do you see what I mean? So
but
that
through
implies
perception. But there is, but that also implies perception, right?
That's there. It's just not limited to perception. So the problem with terms like seeing or pure seeing or witnessing is that it seems to narrow the activity of the soul just to that kind of witnessing. But it can also actually exert control over the physical body and the mind. That's something that's, I think, missing from Sankhya and Yoga and also from Advaita Vedanta.
I see. Yes, I can see where that
Does
would
that
be an
make sense?
argument
Yeah.
all its own, for sure. My teachers have been, they're they teach yoga in a non-dual way where actually the dualistic metaphysics are falsifiable, and it's
I
why
see.
Patanjali ends
I see.
434 in Chit Shakti, like it in this
Oh, that's
feminine
interesting. So
term
they're
of
kind of pushing
Shakti.
it in this divine mother kind of. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, Christopher Chappell and Ian Witcher are the two scholars. And again, I don't want to force fit it anywhere, but I can also really appreciate their point of view. Um, Anything else you would like to share around practical applications? I mean, I really feel like we sort of honed in on it for sure using the Katha Upanishad. Anything else that's a favorite of yours?
Well, maybe I'll just say this because I think it's just very practical and something I tend to emphasize because I think it's important for everybody, regardless of whether you're a monk or a householder, regardless of your identity and this and that, what country you belong to, what culture you belong, or what culture, country, whatever, what religion you belong to. What's crucial is if you're a sincere spiritual aspirant, what's really important is that you not confine your spiritual life just to the meditation movement. So some people think spiritual practice is what I do in the morning or in the evening or both when I wake up and then I go into the shrine or the meditation room and I do my mindfulness practice or I do my yoga or I do my so-and-so, my worship. And then I come out and then I have to raise my kids and then I have to go to work and then that's somehow non-spiritual. But I think that the deeper implications of this life-affirming and ethically oriented Vijnana Vedanta or integral non-dual philosophy is that all life is yoga in a really radical sense. And that we should try to spiritualize every one of our relationships with other human beings, with animals, with the environment, right? So it has environmental implications as well. We should also try to spiritualize our day-to-day activities, whatever it is that we do at work. We should do it. We should try to do it as an offering to the divine by trying to take ego and selfishness out of that work, right? And so the real practice, the real nitty-gritty of spiritual practice is about trying to spiritualize every moment of our lives.
Beautiful. I love how you folded in this idea of ethics as well. I mean, again, as a yogi, the yamas, the first limb of the
Absolutely.
path. I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah.
ethics are a really important, could we say, foundation, resting place.
Yes.
And the other thing that came to me too, as you shared this, is meaning. We're living in an age where meaning is sort of hard to find by many, or it's very vacuous. But this idea of either karma yoga or bhakti yoga or the service, the love, the nonviolence and the truth, but it in the meaning is really, I think, rich, intimate. That's the lover and the beloved, perhaps, right there, and that brings meaning back to this real world, I would say, or it has it gives us the opportunity to bring that meaning back to this real world.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any final thoughts that you have for us? Any final thoughts for our viewers, or anything else you'd like to share?
Well, maybe we can end on this note. I'm a Hindu chaplain at two universities, the University of Southern California and UCLA, and so I interact with young students all the time, and they ask for advice and sort of kind of take home things that they can really like try to practice and incorporate in their daily life. And one of the things I love to tell them is a quotation, just a single sentence of Swami Vivekananda's. The secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. The secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. And if we can have that attitude, it completely transforms the way that we look at ourselves, the way we go through life and go about our day-to-day activities, because it's not, Vedanta isn't preachy. And that's one of the great things about Vedanta. It doesn't say like, do this or don't do that, but it says, whatever it is you want to do, be mindful in the midst of all your experiences. Be mindful before the experience and ask yourself, what do I want to get out of this experience? In the midst of the experience, while you're undergoing the experience, you have to ask yourself, be mindful and ask yourself, am I getting out of this experience what I was looking for? And then after the experience is over, look back on it and ask, did I get out of it what I was really looking for? If we can maintain that mindfulness in the midst of all our experiences, we go through life as kind of learning through all our experiences. I don't think we can go wrong.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing all of your wisdom. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on
Thank
our
you
show
so much.
today.
It was a wonderful conversation. I'm really impressed with your really deep and broad spiritual knowledge, actually. It's wonderful.
I've been studying these things for years, and it makes my heart happy and full. So I'm so
Thank you so
pleased
much.
to be here.
It was a really meaningful conversation. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. And for those of you watching and listening, thank you for being with us. You're the reason that we're here in community, exploring our common unity. You are warmly invited to visit transformationandintegration.com to access additional resources that support the journey through deep transformation, and to learn more about the ongoing offerings at Center for Transformation and Integration, including our certified training in transformational coaching with an emphasis in somatic integration therapy. I look forward to welcoming you there.
You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.